Our speaker today is Jack DeRora. I've known Jack for a long time. I believe in short introductions, he's a good family guy. He's a business attorney, a Navy F-14 pilot. He's a real strong community person. He writes thoughtfully and provocatively about really important issues. You have probably seen one of his columns in either the Columbus Dispatch and or Business First. He just couldn't contain himself to that, and he has branched out, and he's doing a blog now. I'm a subscriber to it, and I would recommend it highly. He covers just an awful lot of topics in a very succinct, concise, and thought-provoking way. Since our speakers can't do self-promotion, I will tell you the blog is www.considerthisbyjd.com. Get on there and take a look. Today, it's about the death penalty, but if we have time and questions, if we exhaust questions about the death penalty, I challenge you to ask Jack about virtually anything else of consequence. He's probably written about it. Jack DeRora.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I have to correct Rick. I was not a pilot. I was a backseater. The backseaters in the F-14 community would take issue with me being characterized as a pilot. So if you read my bio, you see that I'm a business lawyer. And you're saying to yourself, we're going to have a business lawyer talk to us about the death penalty. What's up with that? So let me explain how we get there. I started submitting op-ed pieces for the Dispatch around 1999. And as I started writing, I started branching into various topics. One of the topics was the death penalty, because I had been told, or I had read, that the death penalty can be more costly than a life sentence. And that is just profoundly counterintuitive, isn't it? How can it cost more to keep one, to execute someone, than to give them a life sentence? So I started researching and I started writing. So I probably had 5 or 6 op-ed pieces published in the Dispatch about the death penalty. And I started meeting with state representatives. I just started getting involved in the idea of how do we repeal the death penalty. I've also been down to the death house and death row in Chillicothe. When I drove down there that day, my wife said, "Why are you going down to death row?" And I said, well, I write about these things. I might as well see them. Plus, I'm from Steubenville. I might see somebody I know. Okay. We have 140 men and 1 woman on death row. 28 of them have been there for 15 years. 24 have been there for 20 years. 22 have been there for at least 25 years. Take note, there is no duplication in those numbers that I've given you. So stated another way, half of the people on death row have been there for at least 15 years. Now, why the long time span? There are 3 factors, or excuse me, 1 factor, which is the post-trial litigation that takes place with practically every death sentence. And what do these long post-trial proceedings mean for us as citizens? It means a profound amount of time and money spent in trying to execute these individuals. There are a lot of ways of talking about the death penalty. For me, it's a very interesting subject because it involves a number of issues. You can talk about the death penalty in terms of morality. I think both sides have a great argument, really. You can talk about the death penalty in terms of unfair application at the county level. If you look at Hamilton County and Cuyahoga County, they have a significant number of people on death row, even in light of when you compare populations for their counties. You'll see very few death row offenders from very poor counties. Take your pick. Scioto, whatever. You can look at the death penalty on the basis of unfair application in terms of race. If a black man kills a white person, that offender has a far greater chance of getting the death penalty than a white man who kills a black person, or even a white man, I think, that kills a white man. You can talk about the death penalty in terms of prosecutorial discretion. There is discussion about some prosecutors being heavy-handed in seeking a death warrant. But I focus on time and money because the death penalty reminds me of the movie Groundhog. How many people have seen that movie? So every day when Bill Murray gets up, he knows what's going to happen, he gets a little smarter, he can do the next day a little smarter than he did the previous day, right? That's the great thing. Except we don't get smarter. We give out a death sentence, we've been doing this for years, and we go through the same 15 to 25 years of procedural issues that we've done before. A lot of effort to execute somebody. So how do we have all the tremendous costs? It's a three-part issue. The first is at the trial level. You'll notice that the people you read about, the people who are the subjects of death sentences, are not exactly wealthy people. What does that mean? They'll have a court-appointed attorney. They'll have two court-appointed attorneys for the trial. If they need an expert witness to be involved in the investigation, who pays for that? The state. Death penalty cases just necessarily are longer proceedings. It takes a lot longer to seat a jury. Has anybody been following the Boston Marathon murder? I always get his name wrong. Sarnoff? It took several weeks, if not a couple months, to seat a jury. Why? Let's think about this. He's being prosecuted in federal court in the state of Massachusetts. The federal court still recognizes the death penalty, but Massachusetts doesn't. Massachusetts repealed the death penalty. So now we have a federal court taking place in a state that does not have the death penalty. It's quite a challenge to find jurors who don't have some bias about the death penalty. What about cost as a bottom line? North Carolina estimated that it cost maybe $65,000 more for a capital case than a non-capital case. The second part of the expense is what I mentioned earlier, the post-trial proceedings. Everybody, whether it's a civil or a criminal case, has a right of appellate review. The thought was, with capital cases, we could get rid of the intermediate level of appeal and go straight to the Supreme Court, the Ohio Supreme Court. So that's what goes on now for death penalty cases. But when that proceeding is concluded, offenders have a right of what's called habeas corpus. Nice Latin term, means you have the body. You can apply for review at the federal court, right over here. Only it's a much more expanded review than you have at the appellate court. When you go to the Court of Appeals, it's really the court of errors. What errors were committed at the trial court level? Was evidence admitted that shouldn't have been admitted? Were the jury instructions incorrect? When you go through the process of habeas corpus, it's a much broader review. Now the court looks at things outside the record, which never happens at the appellate level. So now they examine things such as, did you have, Mr. Offender, effective counsel? Were there parts of the case that shouldn't have occurred, things that aren't in the trial record? And then from there, that case might go back to the state trial court, might go back to the federal district court, might go up to the Court of Appeals for the federal system, might come back down. I don't mean to minimize the process, but it's a little bit of like electronic Pong with this case until it comes to some resolution. Duke University compared, now listen closely, compared a death penalty case and 10 years of incarceration with a non-capital case and 20 years of incarceration. The capital case and the 10 years of incarceration cost more. Illinois estimated that it spent $120 million over the course of 10 years to handle just 15 cases. Certainly, when Maryland and Connecticut in the last few years repealed their deaths, it was either Connecticut or Delaware, I always get it wrong, repealed their death penalties, it was based on cost. So why do we have all these costs? Well, think about it. You have a judge, you have prosecutors, you have defense attorneys being paid for by the state. We go to the federal court, we have the federal judge, the federal law clerk. In that federal court building is one full-time and one part-time attorneys. All they handle are death penalty matters. We have Department of Rehabilitation and Correction personnel. There's myriad people involved in trying to bring an offender to the death chamber. So then you say, Jack, I have an idea. We can fix this tomorrow. We'll just shorten that post-trial litigation procedure. Instead of making it 15 to 20 or 25 years, we'll say 5 years or 2 years. That's what we'll do. And on a personal level, that's satisfying to people. Okay, we're going to just execute them quicker. But there's a price for that. Now, how many people read the Dispatch not yesterday, but a week ago? Anybody see the front page? What was it? It was the death penalty. So how many people were released from death row since 2003 for wrongful convictions? The answer is 6. Now, it took years and years to figure that out. You might say, well, how can it take so long to figure it out? And the answer is, I don't know. But certainly the things that you will see are sometimes bad confessions, bad interrogations, lying witnesses, evidence that shouldn't have been admitted. But there are 6 men who have been freed, not just moved to life sentences, but have been released. If you read the paper a few weeks ago, wasn't even a few weeks ago, a gent named Alan Johnson. Alan Johnson was returned or was released and is trying to get a finding that he is, you have to, in order to receive an award of damages for the court for wrongful imprisonment, you have to prove not just that you weren't guilty, but that you are innocent. And there are procedural hurdles holding this man back, who was wrongfully accused of really brutal murder way back in the 1990s. So these cases exist. So saying, oh, gee, we'll just shorten the process doesn't make sense. As I heard one legislator say, you know, if we're going to kill somebody, we ought to take the time to make sure we get it right. The last part of the equation in terms of money is incarceration. Now, we really don't know what it costs to incarcerate people on death row. The department tells us only that it costs about $25,000 a year per inmate. They don't break it down. But we do know a few things. For instance, if you go to a death row wing, there are a few of them, you'll find 3 correctional officers as opposed to 1 correctional officer for the general population. 30 days prior to an execution, there is what is called the 30-day death protocol. So what occurs is there will be a hearing before Judge Frost in federal court. Judge Frost will hear, I don't know how he drew this, but he will hear every 30-day death protocol for Ohio. And at that hearing, a number of questions will be raised. Do we have a sufficient quantity of the lethal drug necessary to conduct the execution? Does the offender have a suitable vein that can be tapped? Has the offender's parent or family been notified? Has the victim's family been notified? Is this offender still mentally competent? In that same newspaper article of a week ago in the Dispatch, 11 people on death row were removed from death row and given very lengthy sentences of between 30 and 50 years because they were found not to be mentally competent. Well, these hearings take anywhere from a couple hours to a few days. There will be present at every hearing 3 assistant attorney generals, 3 defense attorneys. The director of the Rehabilitation and Corrections Department has to be there, a variety of people, all to make sure that this very precise process is being followed. So you're saying, wait a minute. If everything Dorora is saying is right, why do we still chase this death penalty? Few reasons. The first is the costs are not apparent. When you look at the Franklin County budget for judges, it's one line item. It's not broken out for the amount of time we spend on death penalty cases. When you look at the funding for the county sheriff and the time he spends on jail personnel, there's no separate line for those prisoners incarcerated who are facing a death verdict, and so on and so forth. Second thing is people don't know. You now know more about the death penalty than a substantial number of legislators in the General Assembly. Third thing is, it's really, in terms of the state, it's not exactly a state problem in terms of financing, because a majority of this money comes from the counties. Now, certainly some of it is state money, the Attorney General's office, but a substantial money really isn't the direct concern of legislators. And the final problem is that there's no real impetus to change, although we're starting to see things. We're starting to see change, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But for conservative legislators who favor the death penalty, when you talk to them about the cost, they get stuck, because cost and the death penalty are mutually exclusive. You can't have them both. If you want to reduce costs significantly, you can't have the death penalty. And so when you bring that to their attention, well, it's just easier not to address it. Now, you are starting to see some groundswell. We now have a statewide organization called Ohioans to Stop Executions. We've been seeing a lot in the newspapers about the fact that the foreign manufacturer of pentobarbital will no longer allow it to be used for executions. We saw the legislature create a bill that has been criticized by everybody, except for the prosecuting attorneys, that gave anonymity to the compounding pharmacies who will now have to replicate something similar to pentobarbital, but it gave them confidentiality, it gave them anonymity, which was harshly criticized by, as I say, just about everybody, certainly by the Ohio Newspaper Association, every major newspaper in Ohio. But you'll start to see changes, but slowly. So if you're interested, if this resonates with you at all, here are a few things you can do. First of all, just by virtue of listening to me today, you'll be a little more attuned. So when you see these cases in the newspaper, they'll have a little more meaning for you. Take a look when it's a rainy day and you're surfing the web. You can go to the Death Penalty Information Center, which is really this wonderful repository of information for the death penalty in all 50 states. You can talk to your state rep and maybe even illuminate your state rep about the cost of the death penalty. You can join Ohioans to Stop Executions. We would do a lot greater service to ourselves if we would just award life without parole. If we awarded just life without parole for every offender, the right of appeal would stop after about 2 years, because there's no funding for the habeas corpus for non-capital cases. And what's the benefit of that? These people are now out of the news. The families have closure. We're done. And the secondary benefit, there's no likelihood of killing the wrong person, which if we've removed 6 people from death row in the last 12 years, certainly we had to kill at least one wrong person. I'm going to end by making a shameless pitch. If you would like to read my blog, if you give me your card, I'll be happy to subscribe your name. It's an easy 800 to 1,000 words once a week. And if you have any questions, I'm here to take them. If you don't have any questions, please know I'm really delighted for the opportunity to talk with you today, so thank you very much.
Jack, traditionally, one of the arguments for the death penalty has been deterrence. Would you comment on whatever information is available as to whether that works as evidence?
I don't think, you know, the elements of the criminal justice system are retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation. I can't remember the fourth one. So Dwight is asked about deterrence. And I think the studies show that there's no correlation between the death penalty and deterrence. Even for, certainly for states that have repealed the death penalty. And for the most part, from the graphs that I've seen, crime follows national patterns of ebb and flow. No correlation with or without the death penalty. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How much more does it cost compared to the person who's being convicted for life without parole?
Life without parole? We don't know what it costs in Ohio. Ohio has not studied the problem. But certainly North Carolina, Duke, Kansas, Maryland, they have all reached the conclusion that overall, in light of the post-trial proceedings, it definitely costs more to run through the execution process than to award life without parole. Yes, sir.
You mentioned some of the disparities in the statistics between races and prosecution. If you eliminate the possibility of death, does that change?
Well, remember, there are two different things going on.
I guess the question is really, does the prosecution have the same fervor of conviction, etc.?
I really don't know how to answer your question, but I will respond with this. It's a two-phased process. The first is just guilt. The second is sentencing. So we might have the same conviction rate, or we might have a different conviction rate. We might have a different sentencing structure if we didn't have if we eliminated the death penalty, if that answers your question. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just not really clicking with the question is a problem. Yes, sir.
Jack, do Florida and Texas and some of these states that appear to have higher rates of execution, do they have the same processes and procedures that apply in Ohio? Or is it just a larger population that they're dealing with to begin with?
Everybody practices, or the idea of habeas corpus is not unique to Ohio. Texas is certainly the #1 state for actual number of executions. I don't remember where Florida is, but it's certainly up there. I remember someone saying, oh, they have a shorter process in Texas. They kill them quicker. So I pulled down the death penalty. I mean, it's public information. And I looked at it fairly quickly, and it didn't look, I mean, what I saw were a number of offenders who had been on Texas death row for a number of years. But I'll bet Texas has, I'd like to say 400 people on death row. That's certainly a larger number. Steve?
Jack, when you talk, I mean, in relation to Luke's question, can you talk a little bit about how prosecutors use the death penalty when negotiating with the defendant? I think that's very important to them.
Well, first of all, I haven't been privy to that process, but that's certainly a discussion item. And it was a discussion item with the task force chartered by the Supreme Court. About a year and a half ago, the Supreme Court chartered a task force. Its findings were released about a half a year ago. I'm getting to your question indirectly. The charter of that task force was to decide if the death penalty has been applied uniformly in all aspects of uniformity, locale, race, etc. And they made 56 recommendations. Now, the report was poo-pooed by a few prosecutors, but it was a very balanced board. And one of the things was, we don't have equal application in terms of prosecutors. Some use it with, some charge with a heavier hand than others. Now, how you could, considering that we have human beings involved in every step of the process, present greater equality or greater uniformity in how it is to be sought, I don't know the answer to that question, but it was certainly a concern for the task force, absolutely.
Because I don't know, basically my understanding is that they will bring the death penalty if they think they can at the beginning, not that they want to necessarily convict the person of that, but hoping to get a plea because you scare the defendant into saying, if you lose, you're on death row.
Well, that is one advantage of the death row, or excuse me, of the death penalty. And I think we saw that with the offender who killed a couple young kids, was it Knox County, stuffed the remains in a tree, right? It was horrible. But it was, according to the paper, the threat of the death penalty that resulted in a plea. So, it does happen. Anything else? Yes?
To me, the issue is really simple because I'm opposed to the death penalty on moral grounds. Do you have any statistics of how many people have that same view?
I don't have a view. I don't have the stats for morality, but I just saw a poll in February 2014 by Quinnipiac, which said, if you ask people whether they favor the death penalty in the abstract, 68% say yes and 28% say no. But when you ask the question a little differently, how about life with the possibility of parole? Now the pro-death penalty number drops to 48%. The folks in favor of life without parole is 38%. And the percentage of folks who say, well, life with the possibility of parole is 12%. So when you add those numbers up, when you add in the mix of some kind of life sentence, it's almost 50-50. But of course, that poll didn't address your core issue of morality. And I'm CK's here, which means I got to stop. Hey, thank you for having me.
Please join us next week to hear Betsy Pandora speak about Short North Alliance. This meeting is adjourned.